They say blood is thicker than water, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes your own blood will drain you dry while convincing you it's for your own good. I'm Margaret Chen, and at 67 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of manipulation there was. I was wrong. What my daughter Victoria did to me over the span of 6 months didn't just break my heart. It opened my eyes to a truth so devastating that it changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and the price of trust. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first warning sign should have been when Victoria started visiting me more often. After years of quick holiday stops and rushed phone calls, suddenly my eldest daughter was showing up at my Marin County home every weekend, sometimes with her husband Derek, sometimes alone. She'd bring expensive wine and organic groceries, insisting on cooking elaborate meals while chatting about her work at the tech startup and Derek's promotion at the consulting firm. I should have been suspicious. Victoria had always been my most independent child, the one who moved 3,000 miles away for college and only came back to California when Derek got transferred to San Francisco. But I was lonely. My husband, Thomas, had passed away 2 years earlier, and the big house that had once buzzed with family gatherings now echoed with silence. Having Victoria back in my life felt like a gift I didn't dare question. The conversation started innocently enough. We'd be sitting on my wraparound porch, looking out over the rolling hills dotted with oak trees, and Victoria would mention how worried she was about me living alone. "Mom, this house is so isolated," she'd say, gesturing toward the winding driveway that stretched a 1/4 mile from the main road. "What if something happened to you? What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone?" I'd brush off her concerns with the confidence of someone who'd been managing just fine on her own. At 67, I was still sharp, still active. I maintained a vegetable garden, took long walks through the property, and managed my real estate portfolio without assistance. The portfolio itself was substantial: 12 rental properties scattered throughout Northern California, from beachfront condos in Santa Cruz to Victorian apartments in San Francisco. Thomas and I had built it together over 30 years, starting with a small duplex in Berkeley when Victoria was just a baby. But Victoria was persistent in her worry, and gradually her concerns began to feel less like care and more like pressure. She started bringing articles about elderly people who'd been found days after accidents, stories about seniors who'd been taken advantage of by contractors or caregivers. She'd leave them strategically placed around my kitchen, folded open to the most frightening paragraphs. "I found this in my neighborhood newsletter," she'd say, sliding a printed article across my granite countertop. "This poor woman in Mill Valley lived alone just like you. She fell down her stairs and wasn't found for 3 days. 3 days, Mom. Can you imagine?" The articles multiplied. Stories about elderly fraud victims, about seniors with dementia, who'd signed away their life savings, about isolated older people who'd become easy targets for every kind of predator. Victoria would read them aloud during our dinners, her voice heavy with manufactured concern, always ending with the same refrain: "I just can't stop worrying about you out here all alone." I began to notice other things too. How Victoria would study my mail when she thought I wasn't looking, flipping through bank statements and investment reports with casual curiosity. How she'd ask seemingly innocent questions about my tenants, about property values, about my plans for the future. "Have you thought about what happens to all this when you're gone?" she'd ask, waving her hand to encompass the house, the land, the life Thomas and I had built. The truth was, I had thought about it extensively. My will was meticulously organized, my finances managed by a trusted advisor who'd been helping me for 15 years. But Victoria made it sound like I was living in denial, like I was being irresponsible by not planning for my own decline. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was a rainy Thursday in October when I slipped on my kitchen floor, landing hard on my hip. Nothing was broken, but I was shaken and sore. I called Victoria to let her know what had happened, thinking she'd want to check on me. What I got instead was a lecture about how this was exactly what she'd been warning me about. "Mom, this is it," she said, her voice tight with what I thought was fear. "This is the wake-up call we've been dreading. You could have been seriously hurt. You could have been lying there for hours." She insisted on coming over immediately, arriving with Derek and a somber expression that made my minor fall feel like a near-death experience. They fussed over me, insisted I see a doctor, and spent the entire weekend treating me like an invalid. By Sunday evening, Victoria had worked herself into such a state of anxiety that she was practically in tears. "I can't sleep at night knowing—" "You're out here alone," she confessed as she helped me make tea. "Every time my phone rings, I think it's going to be the hospital, or the police, or someone telling me something terrible has happened to you." Her distress seemed so genuine, so heartfelt, that I found myself reconsidering my situation. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was being stubborn and foolish, clinging to independence when what I really needed was security. The house was large and isolated. The stairs were steep. At 67, was I really prepared to handle every emergency that might arise? That's when Victoria introduced the solution she'd apparently been developing for months. "Derek and I have been talking," she said, settling beside me on the couch where Thomas and I used to watch evening news together. "We think you should move in with us. Our house has a beautiful guest suite with its own entrance. You'd have privacy and independence, but we'd be right there if you needed anything." The idea had merit, I had to admit. Victoria and Derek lived in a stunning contemporary home in Sausalito with views of the bay and easy access to medical facilities. The guest suite she described was lovely, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a private garden. But something about the proposal made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on what. What about this place? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I asked, gesturing around the home where I'd raised 3 children and buried a husband. "What about the properties? I can't manage everything from Sausalito." Victoria was ready with answers for every objection. "You don't need to manage the properties yourself anymore, Mom. That's what property management companies are for. Or," she paused, as if the idea had just occurred to her, "you could transfer everything to me. I could handle all the details, make sure you're getting the income you need without any of the stress." There it was, the real reason for all the weekend visits, all the concerned articles, all the careful cultivation of my fears. Victoria didn't just want me to move in with her. She wanted control of my real estate portfolio, the 12 properties that generated nearly $18,000 a month in rental income. The properties that represented not just my financial security, but Thomas's legacy and my children's inheritance. But I didn't see it then. I was still operating under the assumption that my daughter's concern was genuine, that her solution was motivated by love rather than greed. So when she suggested I consult with Derek about the transfer, Derek, who conveniently happened to be an estate planning consultant, I agreed to hear what he had to say. The meeting took place the following weekend in my dining room, around the mahogany table where we'd celebrated countless family holidays. Derek arrived with a briefcase full of documents and a presentation that was clearly well rehearsed. Victoria sat beside him, nodding along as he explained how transferring the properties to her would simplify my life and ensure proper management. "The beauty of this arrangement," Derek said, spreading papers across the table, "is that you maintain all the financial benefits while eliminating all the responsibilities. Victoria becomes the legal owner, handles all tenant issues, maintenance, taxes, everything. You receive a guaranteed monthly payment that's actually higher than what you're getting now because we'll be able to optimize rent rates and reduce expenses." He showed me charts and projections, cost-benefit analyses that made the transfer look not just sensible but profitable. Victoria would pay me $22,000 a month for life, significantly more than the properties currently generated. In exchange, she would assume all ownership responsibilities and eventually inherit everything anyway. This way, you get to see your legacy in action, Victoria added, reaching across to squeeze my hand. You get to watch me build on what you and Dad created, instead of just hoping I'll do right by it after you're gone. The presentation was polished and persuasive, addressing every concern I might have while painting a picture of a stress-free future where I could focus on enjoying my retirement instead of worrying about property management. Derek had even researched assisted living facilities, just in case I eventually needed more care than Victoria could provide. We want to make sure you have every option available, he explained, showing me brochures for exclusive senior communities with waiting lists years long. Some of these places require significant upfront investments, but with the guaranteed income from this arrangement, you'd qualify for the very best care available. I found myself nodding along, caught up in their vision of my future. They made it sound like they were offering me freedom instead of asking me to give up control. The monthly payment they proposed was generous, more than enough to cover my living expenses with plenty left over for travel and leisure. And the idea of not having to deal with tenant complaints, property repairs, and tax complications was undeniably appealing. But that night, alone in the house where Thomas and I had made every major decision together, I felt a nagging unease I couldn't shake. Something about the speed with which Victoria and Derek had produced such detailed plans bothered me. The presentation felt too polished, too complete, as if they'd been working on it for months rather than days. I called my son Michael in Portland, the middle child who'd inherited Thomas's cautious nature and analytical mind. I told him about Victoria's concerns, about the fall, about the proposed arrangement. I expected him to share Victoria's worries about my living situation. Instead, his response surprised me. "Mom, you fell on a wet floor. That could happen to anyone at any age. Did you break anything? Do you need surgery? Are you experiencing any cognitive issues?" When I answered no to all his questions, he was quiet for a moment. "Then why are we talking about you giving up your independence and your financial autonomy?" His questions forced me to examine the situation more objectively. Had I really become incapable of managing my own life, or had Victoria convinced me I was more vulnerable than I actually was? The fall had been minor, the kind of household accident that happens to people of all ages. My mental faculties were sharp, my health was good, and I'd been successfully managing complex financial affairs for decades. "Has Victoria always been this concerned about your welfare?" Michael asked. "Because I seem to remember her being pretty hands-off until recently." He was right. Victoria's sudden, intense involvement in my life had begun only a few months earlier, around the time Derek's consulting firm had lost several major clients and their own financial situation had become strained. I'd noticed Victoria mentioning money more often, complaining about their mortgage payments and the costs of maintaining their lifestyle in Marin County. That realization should have been enough to make me suspicious, but I wasn't ready to believe my daughter was capable of such calculated manipulation. Instead, I told myself that perhaps her financial stress was making her more aware of the importance of family security. Maybe she was genuinely trying to protect me while also ensuring her own future stability. I decided to slow down the process, to take more time to consider such a significant decision. When I told Victoria I wanted to consult with my own financial advisor before moving forward, her reaction was telling. The patient, understanding daughter who'd been so concerned about my welfare was suddenly impatient and frustrated. "Mom, we've already laid out all the numbers for you," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "What exactly do you think your advisor is going to tell you that Derek hasn't already covered? This is a generous offer, and the longer we wait, the more complicated things become." The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria began visiting more frequently, each time bringing up new urgencies that made the transfer seem more pressing. Property values were shifting. Tax laws were changing. Interest rates were fluctuating. According to her, waiting meant missing opportunities and creating unnecessary complications. Derek joined these conversations with increasing frequency, always armed with new information about market conditions or legal requirements that supported their timeline. They painted a picture of a narrow window of opportunity that would soon close, leaving me vulnerable to economic changes beyond my control. The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. They never directly pressured me or threatened consequences if I didn't comply. Instead, they created an atmosphere of loving urgency, where delaying the decision felt like reckless irresponsibility rather than prudent caution. They positioned themselves as my protectors, trying to shield me from dangers I was too naive or stubborn to recognize. But their impatience revealed something important about their true motivations. If this arrangement was really in my best interest, why couldn't it wait for me to feel completely comfortable with the decision? If they were truly concerned about my welfare, why did my desire for additional consultation frustrate them so much? I began to pay closer attention to the things they weren't saying, to the questions they deflected rather than answered. When I asked about what would happen if Victoria decided to sell the properties, Derek launched into a complex explanation about market timing and portfolio optimization that didn't actually address my concern. When I wondered about my recourse if the monthly payments stopped for any reason, Victoria seemed hurt that I would even consider such a possibility. "Mom, I'm your daughter," she said, her eyes filling with tears that looked genuine but felt manufactured. "How can you think I would ever do anything to hurt you? This entire arrangement is about making sure you're taken care of for the rest of your life." The emotional manipulation was perhaps the most effective part of their strategy. Every question I raised was treated as evidence of my lack of trust, rather than legitimate concern about a complex financial arrangement. They made me feel guilty for being cautious, selfish for wanting to maintain control, and paranoid for imagining scenarios where their plan might not work in my favor. But Michael's questions had planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each conversation. I started doing my own research, reading about elder financial abuse and the warning signs of family exploitation. What I learned was disturbing. Adult children convincing elderly parents to transfer assets was one of the most common forms of financial abuse, often disguised as concern for the parents' welfare. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Adult children would identify vulnerabilities in their parents' situations, amplify fears about safety or competence, then position themselves as the solution to problems they'd helped create. The transfer of assets was always presented as temporary or beneficial to the elder, but once legal ownership changed hands, the adult children's true intentions often became clear. I wasn't ready to believe Victoria was following this pattern, but I couldn't ignore the similarities either. Her sudden concern about my welfare, her focus on the isolation and dangers of my living situation, her ready solution that happened to benefit her financially, it all aligned too perfectly with the warning signs I was reading about. That's when I decided to test her motivations. If Victoria was genuinely concerned about my safety and welfare, she would support arrangements that addressed those concerns without requiring me to transfer my assets. If her primary goal was gaining control of my properties, she would resist alternatives that didn't serve that purpose. I called her on a Wednesday morning and proposed a compromise. Instead of transferring the properties to her, I would hire a property management company to handle day-to-day operations while maintaining ownership myself. I would also install a medical alert system and arrange for regular check-ins from a local senior services organization. Victoria's response was immediate and telling. "Mom, that's not really solving the problem," she said, her voice carrying an edge of frustration she tried to disguise as concern. "Property management companies charge huge fees and don't really care about maximizing your returns. And those senior services people are strangers. How can you trust them to really look out for you?" She had an objection to every alternative. I proposed. Professional property management was too expensive and impersonal. Medical alert systems were unreliable and couldn't prevent all accidents. Senior services were bureaucratic and couldn't provide the personalized attention I needed. According to Victoria, only family could be trusted to truly protect my interests. But when I suggested she could help me oversee the professional management without actually owning the properties, she became even more resistant. That arrangement wouldn't provide the streamlined decision-making that emergency situations required. It wouldn't protect me from the stress of ultimate responsibility. It wouldn't ensure that my legacy would be properly preserved and developed. Each objection revealed more about her true priorities. Victoria didn't just want to help me manage my properties, she wanted to own them. She didn't just want to ensure my security, she wanted control over my assets. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. I began to see our recent interactions in a new light. The strategic placement of frightening articles about elderly people living alone. The amplification of my minor fall into a major safety crisis. The ready availability of detailed transfer documents. The timeline. Urgency that discouraged careful consideration. It was all part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to separate me from my financial independence. The hardest part was accepting that my own daughter was capable of such manipulation. Victoria had been the golden child, the high achiever who'd graduated summa cum laude from Stanford and built a successful career in technology. She'd always been ambitious and sometimes self-centered, but I'd never imagined she would use my love for her against me. But the evidence was overwhelming. Victoria's concern for my welfare was directly proportional to her interest in my assets. Her solutions to my supposed problems all involved transferring control to her. Her timeline for action aligned with her own financial pressures rather than any real emergency in my situation. I felt like I was seeing my daughter clearly for the first time in years, and what I saw was someone who'd learned to view relationships as transactions, love as leverage, and family as a source of financial opportunity. The realization broke something inside me, but it also freed me to act in my own interests for the first time in months. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I would give Victoria exactly what she'd asked for, but not in the way she expected. If she wanted my real estate portfolio so badly, if she was willing to manipulate and deceive to get it, then she could have it. But she would also learn what it really meant to own those properties. And the lesson would cost her more than she ever imagined. The plan that formed in my mind was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria thought she understood the value and obligations of property ownership, but her understanding was based on the sanitized version Derek had presented in his polished presentation. She saw rental income and property appreciation, but hadn't considered vacancy rates, major repairs, difficult tenants, regulatory changes, or market downturns. More importantly, she didn't understand that the properties weren't just assets. They were businesses that required constant attention, expertise, and capital investment. Thomas and I had spent 30 years learning how to manage them effectively, building relationships with contractors, understanding local markets, and developing the skills needed to maximize returns while minimizing risks. Victoria was about to discover that owning rental properties was very different from inheriting money. And I was going to make sure she learned that lesson in the most comprehensive way possible. The next morning, I called Victoria with a decision that would seal both our fates. My voice was steady, almost cheerful, as I delivered the news she'd been working toward for months. "I've been thinking about everything you and Derek said," I began, watching through my kitchen window as a red-tailed hawk circled over the oak grove. "You're right. I am getting older, and managing all these properties is becoming overwhelming. I'd like to move forward with the transfer." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough for me to picture Victoria's face lighting up with triumph. When she spoke, her voice was carefully modulated, trying to sound relieved rather than victorious. "Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you've come to this decision. I know it wasn't easy, but you're doing the right thing for everyone involved. Derek and I will take such good care of everything, and you'll finally be able to relax and enjoy your retirement. We arranged to meet that weekend to finalize the details. Victoria suggested we use Derek's office in downtown San Francisco, a move that should have raised red flags but instead struck me as appropriately professional. She was taking this transition seriously, treating it with the gravity that a multi-million-dollar asset transfer deserved. What Victoria didn't know was that I'd spent the previous 3 days making some transfers of my own. Not of the properties themselves, but of certain crucial elements that would make owning them significantly more challenging than she anticipated. I started with the property management systems. For 30 years, Thomas and I had developed relationships with a network of contractors, maintenance crews, landscapers, and repair specialists who knew our properties intimately. These weren't random service providers found in phone books, but carefully vetted professionals who understood our standards, our budgets, and our expectations. Over the past 3 days, I'd systematically terminated every one of these relationships. The plumber who'd maintained the Victorian apartments in San Francisco for 15 years received notice that his services would no longer be needed. The landscaping crew that had kept the Santa Cruz condos looking pristine got the same message. The general contractor who'd overseen countless renovations and repairs across all 12 properties was told to remove our addresses from his schedule. By the time I signed the transfer documents, Victoria would inherit 12 properties with no established support network, no trusted contractors, and no maintenance agreements. She would own the buildings, but she would have to rebuild from scratch all the operational relationships that made them profitable. But that was just the beginning. I'd also been busy with the properties themselves, identifying and addressing what property managers call deferred maintenance in the most expensive way possible. The Victorian apartments needed new roofing, a fact I'd been planning to address gradually over the next 2 years. Instead, I hired a contractor to strip the old roof completely, leaving the buildings covered with tarps and requiring immediate replacement to prevent water damage. The Santa Cruz condos had been due for exterior painting, another project I'd planned to spread across multiple seasons. Instead, I had the existing paint stripped using an environmental remediation process that was thorough, expensive, and left the buildings looking like construction sites that required immediate attention. At the Berkeley duplex, I discovered extensive termite damage that had been manageable with regular treatment, but now required immediate structural repairs. The Marin County townhouses needed new HVAC systems, work I'd scheduled for the following year, but now moved up to create an urgent timeline that would stress any new owner. Each property suddenly had immediate, expensive needs that couldn't be deferred without risking serious damage or code violations. But here's the beautiful part. All of these were legitimate maintenance issues that any responsible property owner would need to address eventually. I wasn't sabotaging the properties or creating fake problems. I was simply accelerating the timeline so that Victoria would inherit not just the assets, but also the immediate responsibility for hundreds of thousands of dollars in essential repairs. The financial pressure would be immediate and intense. Even with the rental income from the properties, Victoria would need substantial liquid capital to address all the urgent maintenance issues. She'd have to choose between depleting her savings, taking out loans against the properties, or watching her new assets deteriorate while she scrambled for solutions. But I wasn't finished yet. The rental situations themselves were about to become significantly more complicated. I'd spent weeks reviewing every lease agreement, every tenant relationship, every rental rate across all 12 properties. What I discovered was that my conservative management style had left substantial room for optimization, but optimization in the wrong direction. 3 of my long-term tenants were paying below market rates, a decision Thomas and I had made to reward reliability and reduce turnover. These tenants had been with us for years, maintaining the properties beautifully and never causing problems. But their leases were month-to-month agreements that could be adjusted with proper notice. I raised their rents to market rate immediately, giving them the required 30-day notice. 2 of them, predictably, gave notice that they would be moving out rather than paying the higher rates. That meant Victoria would inherit properties with immediate vacancy losses and the need to find new tenants quickly to maintain cash flow. But finding good tenants in California's complex rental market isn't simple, especially when you don't have established relationships with property management companies, credit check services, or experienced leasing agents. Victoria would have to build these relationships from scratch while dealing with vacant units that were generating no income but still requiring maintenance, insurance, and tax payments. The timing of these vacancies was particularly devastating. I'd scheduled them to coincide with the expensive maintenance issues, creating a perfect storm of high expenses and reduced income right as Victoria was taking ownership. She would inherit properties that were bleeding money and demanding immediate attention, expertise, and capital investment. Meanwhile, I was making other arrangements that would ensure my own financial security while teaching Victoria some valuable lessons about assuming control of other people's carefully managed assets. The guaranteed monthly payment Derek had promised me wasn't actually guaranteed by anything more than their word and their continued financial stability. Instead of relying on their promise, I liquidated several investment accounts and used the proceeds to purchase an immediate annuity that would provide me with income regardless of what happened to the properties or Victoria's ability to pay. The annuity wasn't as generous as the payment Victoria had offered, but it was absolutely secure and would last for my lifetime. I also established a separate emergency fund that would allow me to maintain my independence regardless of how the property transfer played out. If Victoria proved capable of managing the challenges I'd created, wonderful. If she failed and the properties fell into disrepair or foreclosure, I would still be financially secure and emotionally detached from the outcome. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most important part of my plan. For months, Victoria had been working to convince me that I was too old, too frail, and too incompetent to manage my own affairs. She'd used my love for her and my fear of becoming a burden to manipulate me into surrendering control of my life's work. But now I understood something crucial about manipulation. It only works if the victim cares more about the relationship than about their own well-being. Victoria's power over me came from my desire to be a good mother, to be supportive and trusting, and generous. She'd weaponized my maternal instincts against my own interests. Once I recognized the manipulation for what it was, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I was no longer trying to be the mother Victoria wanted me to be. I was no longer prioritizing her needs over my own judgment. I was no longer making decisions based on guilt, fear, or the desire to maintain family harmony. Instead, I was acting with the same business acumen that had helped Thomas and me build our real estate portfolio in the first place. I was making strategic decisions based on realistic assessments of risk and reward. I was protecting my own interests while letting Victoria experience the natural consequences of her choices. The weekend meeting in Derek's office went exactly as I'd expected. The conference room was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district and a mahogany table that belonged in a movie about high-stakes negotiations. Victoria and Derek had prepared a ceremonial atmosphere for what they clearly saw as their victory. Derek had organized the documents with theatrical precision, each stack of papers representing a different aspect of the transfer. Property deeds, tax documents, insurance policies, tenant agreements, maintenance records, everything organized and labeled with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Margaret, I want you to understand that this is one of the most comprehensive property transfers I've ever facilitated, Derek said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing other people's financial decisions. We've anticipated every possible complication and created protections for everyone involved. Victoria sat beside him, practically glowing with satisfaction. She'd worn her most professional outfit, a charcoal suit that made her look like she belonged in this world of high-stakes real estate transactions. Her smile was warm and grateful, the perfect expression of a loving daughter accepting a generous gift from a trusting mother. They walked me through each document with patient thoroughness, explaining terms and conditions as if I were a confused elderly woman who needed guidance, understanding complex financial arrangements. Their condescension was subtle but unmistakable, reinforcing the narrative they'd constructed about my declining competence and their superior judgment. I signed everything with steady hands and a clear mind, knowing exactly what I was doing and why. Each signature transferred not just legal ownership, but also complete responsibility for everything these properties would demand in the coming months. Victoria thought she was gaining valuable assets. In reality, she was inheriting a financial nightmare that would test every assumption she'd made about property ownership. The closing celebration was particularly satisfying to watch. Derek opened a bottle of champagne he'd brought for the occasion, toasting the successful completion of what he called a perfect example of intergenerational wealth transfer. Victoria raised her glass with tears in her eyes, thanking me for trusting her with our family's legacy. "Mom, I promise you won't regret this decision," she said, her voice thick with emotion that felt genuine in the moment. "Derek and I are going to take such good care of everything. You'll see returns you never imagined, and you'll never have to worry about property management stress again." I smiled and clinked my glass against theirs, savoring the irony of the moment. Victoria had no idea that the stress was just beginning, that the returns she'd promised were about to be eaten alive by the expenses she hadn't anticipated. In her mind, she'd just acquired a portfolio of income-generating assets. In reality, she'd just inherited a full-time job that would consume her time, her money, and her peace of mind. The first call came 3 days later. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the hills in shades of gold and amber, when my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and I could hear the stress in her voice before she even spoke. "Mom, we have a problem with the Santa Cruz properties. The contractor you were using called Derek this morning. Apparently, there's some kind of emergency with the exterior work. He says the buildings are covered with tarps and need immediate attention, or there could be water damage." I took a sip of my coffee, savoring both the rich flavor and the panic in my daughter's voice. "Oh yes, the exterior restoration project. I meant to mention that. The old paint contained lead, so it required special environmental remediation. The contractor should have left detailed instructions about the next steps. He said the next steps involve hiring a specialized crew and spending at least $50,000 on emergency weatherproofing. $50,000, Mom? We weren't budgeting for that kind of immediate expense." There was something delicious about the way she said "we," as if she and Derek were partners in this venture, rather than sole owners of properties that were now their complete responsibility. She was already trying to make their problem into our problem, to draw me back into the management role she'd worked so hard to take away from me. "Well, you'll need to handle that however you think best," I said, my voice bright and helpful. Thomas and I always found that getting multiple quotes was useful for large projects like that. You might also want to check with the insurance company about whether emergency weatherproofing is covered under the policy. "But Mom, we don't know these contractors. We don't know who to trust or how to evaluate quotes. Can't you give us some guidance? Maybe call your usual contractor and ask him to handle this?" I almost laughed at the request. Victoria had spent months convincing me that I was too old and incompetent to manage these properties effectively. Now, faced with her first real challenge as an owner, she wanted me to solve her problems using the expertise and relationships she'd dismissed as inadequate. "I'm afraid I can't help with that," I said, my voice warm but firm. "Remember, the whole point of this transfer was to relieve me of property management responsibilities. Besides, I've already terminated my relationships with all the contractors. I didn't think it was fair to burden them with divided loyalties when you'd be wanting to establish your own professional relationships." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I could practically hear Victoria's mind racing as she processed the implications of what I'd just told her. She'd inherited not just the properties, but also the complete responsibility for rebuilding every operational relationship from scratch. "You terminated all the contractor relationships?" she asked, her voice small and incredulous. "Of course, dear. It's standard practice when transferring property ownership. You and Derek will want to build your own network of service providers, people you trust and who understand your management style. It's actually quite exciting having the opportunity to start fresh and optimize everything according to your own standards." The second call came 2 hours later. This time it was Derek, his voice carrying the controlled frustration of someone trying to maintain professional composure while dealing with an emerging crisis. "Margaret, I'm hoping you can help us understand something about the Berkeley property. We've had 3 different contractors out there this morning, and they're all telling us there's significant structural damage that needs immediate attention. Were you aware of this issue?" I was aware of it, of course. I'd been managing the termite situation with regular treatments and monitoring for years, keeping it under control with the kind of ongoing maintenance that prevented small problems from becoming major disasters. But I deliberately suspended the treatment program 2 months ago, knowing that the existing damage would accelerate quickly without proper management. "Termites can be tricky," I acknowledged. "Thomas and I dealt with them periodically over the years. You'll want to get a structural engineer involved to assess the damage and develop a comprehensive treatment plan. I think we used someone from Berkeley, but I can't remember the name. You might try looking online. The contractors are saying this could cost anywhere from $30,000 to $70,000, depending on how extensive the damage is. That's on top of the Santa Cruz situation. Margaret, we're looking at potentially over $100,000 in immediate expenses across just 2 properties." There was accusation in his voice, the suggestion that I'd somehow hidden these problems or failed to disclose the true condition of the properties. But I'd been completely honest about the maintenance requirements during our transfer discussions. I'd simply accelerated the timeline so that all the deferred maintenance became immediate rather than gradual. "Property ownership always involves unexpected expenses," I said, channeling the same patronizing tone Derek had used when explaining the transfer benefits to me. "That's why Thomas and I always maintained substantial cash reserves. I'm sure you and Victoria planned for capital expenditures when you calculated the financial projections." Another silence, longer this time. Derek hadn't planned for immediate, major expenses because he'd focused on the income potential rather than the operational realities. His spreadsheets had projected steady rental income and gradual property appreciation, not the kind of crisis management that real property ownership actually required. The third call came that evening, just as I was preparing dinner. Victoria again, but this time her voice carried an edge of desperation that was impossible to miss. "Mom, we need to talk. Can I come over tonight? Derek and I have been dealing with property emergencies all day, and we need your advice about how to handle everything." I could hear Derek in the background, his voice tense as he spoke on another phone call. Something about insurance claims and emergency contractors. Their dream of passive real estate income was colliding with the reality of active property management, and they were already overwhelmed. "Of course you can come over," I said graciously. "But I hope you understand that I can't get too involved in management decisions. The whole point of the transfer was to give you control and responsibility. I wouldn't want to undermine your authority by second-guessing your choices." Victoria arrived an hour later, looking like she'd aged years in the 3 days since our celebration in Derek's office. Her professional confidence had been replaced by frazzled exhaustion, her perfectly styled hair showing signs of stress-related disruption. She collapsed onto my living room sofa with the dramatic flair of someone reaching the end of her emotional resources. "Mom, this is insane. We've been dealing with crisis after crisis ever since we took ownership. It's like everything started falling apart the moment the transfer went through." I settled into my favorite armchair, the one where Thomas and I used to discuss property management decisions, and regarded my daughter with the kind of patient sympathy I might show a child learning a difficult lesson. Property ownership can be challenging, I agreed. Thomas and I learned that over many years of experience. It takes time to develop the systems and relationships that make it manageable. But how did you handle all this stress? How did you deal with multiple emergencies happening at the same time? Today alone, we've had to coordinate 3 different contractor visits, file an insurance claim, arrange emergency financing, and try to figure out which tenants are planning to move out. It's overwhelming. The irony was exquisite. Victoria had spent months telling me I was too old and stressed to handle property management effectively. Now she was discovering that the work she'd dismissed as too difficult for me was actually too difficult for her as well, despite being 30 years younger and having Derek's professional expertise to draw upon. Experience helps, I said gently. Thomas and I made plenty of mistakes in our early years. We learned to budget for emergencies, to maintain relationships with reliable contractors, to stay on top of maintenance issues before they became crises. It's all part of the learning process. Victoria looked up at me with something approaching desperation. Could you maybe help us transition more gradually? Maybe continue to handle some of the contractor relationships while we get established? I know we said you'd be completely free of responsibilities, but this is harder than we expected. There it was, the request I'd been waiting for. Victoria wanted me to continue doing the work while she enjoyed the benefits of ownership. She wanted to maintain control of the assets while delegating the actual management back to me. It was the same pattern of exploitation, just with a different legal structure. I'm afraid that wouldn't be appropriate, I said, my voice kind but firm. You and Derek were very clear that you wanted complete control and responsibility. It wouldn't be fair for me to interfere with your learning process by trying to manage things from the sidelines. But Mom, we're drowning here. We don't have the experience or the relationships to handle this level of complexity. Can't you at least give us the names of your contractors? Help us understand how you prioritized maintenance issues? I smiled at her with genuine warmth, the kind of expression a teacher might give a student who was finally beginning to understand the difficulty of a subject they'd previously dismissed as easy. Victoria, dear, you spent months convincing me that I was too old and incompetent to handle these responsibilities effectively. You argued that my management style was outdated and that you and Derek could optimize everything with your superior skills and knowledge. Were you wrong about that? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Victoria couldn't ask for my help without admitting that her assessment of my competence had been completely incorrect. She couldn't claim the properties were too difficult to manage without contradicting her own arguments about why the transfer was necessary. Her face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from being trapped by your own contradictions. That's not fair, Mom. We never said you were incompetent. We were worried about your safety and your stress levels. We wanted to help you, not steal from you. And you have helped me, I replied. I haven't received a single call from a tenant or contractor since the transfer. I haven't had to worry about maintenance schedules or vacancy rates or property taxes. You've given me exactly the freedom from responsibility that you promised. Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working to process this new version of her mother. The confused, frightened elderly woman she'd been manipulating for months had vanished, replaced by someone who was clearly in complete control of her faculties and her decisions. You planned this, she said slowly, her voice carrying a mixture of realization and accusation. The contractor terminations, the accelerated maintenance, the tenant situations. You deliberately created these problems. I considered her accusation carefully before responding. I didn't create any problems, Victoria. I simply stopped managing situations that required ongoing attention. Everything you're dealing with now is the natural result of property ownership. The only difference is that you're experiencing it all at once instead of gradually over time. But you could have warned us. You could have prepared us for what we were taking on. I tried to slow down the transfer process so you could do more due diligence, I reminded her. You and Derek insisted that waiting was unnecessary and potentially harmful. You said you understood the responsibilities of property ownership and were prepared to handle them. The conversation continued for another hour, with Victoria alternating between asking for help, expressing frustration at the situation, and trying to make me feel guilty for not rescuing her from the consequences of her own choices. But I remained pleasantly unhelpful, offering sympathy without solutions and encouragement without assistance. By the time she left, Victoria looked genuinely shaken. The confident woman who'd celebrated her acquisition of valuable assets had been replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the difference between owning properties and successfully managing them. The calls became a daily occurrence after that. Victoria and Derek encountered new crises with predictable regularity as the full scope of their new responsibilities became clear. Tenant complaints about delayed maintenance, contractor disputes, about payment terms, insurance complications related to the emergency repairs, city inspections that revealed code violations requiring immediate attention. Each crisis was real, urgent, and expensive. Each phone call to me was an opportunity for Victoria to ask for help that I politely declined to provide. Each conversation reinforced the lesson that property ownership was a complex business requiring experience, relationships, and capital that she didn't possess. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Victoria was about to discover that the financial projections Derek had prepared were based on assumptions that bore little resemblance to reality. The guaranteed monthly payment they'd promised me was about to become impossible to maintain, and their own financial stability was about to be threatened by the very assets they'd worked so hard to acquire. The properties weren't just demanding immediate attention and expense. They were about to teach Victoria and Derek the most expensive lesson of their lives about the difference between theoretical property ownership and the brutal reality of hands-on real estate management. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the transfer, on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang before 7 o'clock. I was in my garden, deadheading roses and enjoying the crisp autumn air, when Derek's number flashed across the screen. His voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before, professional composure completely abandoned. "Margaret, we need to meet today. This situation has become untenable, and we need to discuss our options moving forward." There was something final in his tone, a quality that suggested this wasn't another request for advice or assistance. This was surrender, though he was trying to package it as a business discussion. I agreed to meet them at my house that afternoon, curious to see how they would frame their capitulation. They arrived together but separately, if that makes sense. Victoria looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by the harried look of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Derek carried a briefcase that seemed heavier than usual, weighted down with documents that I suspected would tell a story of financial disaster. We sat in my living room, the same space where Victoria had first floated the idea of me moving in with them, back when she was still pretending her concerns were about my welfare rather than my assets. The autumn light streaming through the windows illuminated the stress lines that had appeared around Victoria's eyes, aging her in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. Derek opened his briefcase with the methodical movements of someone delivering bad news to a client. The papers he spread across my coffee table told the story I'd been expecting. Cash flow projections that had collapsed under the weight of reality, expense reports that read like financial horror stories, and spreadsheets showing mounting losses that threatened not just the properties, but their personal financial stability. "The situation is more challenging than we initially projected," Derek began, his consultant's language failing to mask the desperation underneath. "The combination of immediate capital requirements and reduced rental income has created a liquidity crisis that requires immediate attention." I studied the documents with the kind of detached interest I might show toward someone else's business problems. The numbers were even worse than I'd anticipated. Victoria and Derek had burned through their savings trying to address the emergency, maintenance issues, taken out loans against their personal residence to cover additional expenses, and were now facing monthly property costs that exceeded rental income by substantial margins. How substantial? I asked, though I could see the answer in the red ink that dominated their financial projections. We're losing approximately $8,000 per month across the portfolio, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's after Derek took a second mortgage on our house to cover the initial emergency repairs. $8,000 per month. Over the course of a year, that represented nearly $100,000 in losses. For a couple who'd been counting on property income to enhance their lifestyle, the reality of property ownership was proving financially catastrophic. But the numbers only told part of the story. I could see in their faces the toll that constant crisis management had taken on their relationship, their health, and their peace of mind. Victoria had lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once carried confidence like armor. Derek's usual polished demeanor had been replaced by the desperate energy of someone fighting a losing battle. We've been thinking, Victoria continued, that maybe we moved too quickly with the transition. Maybe there should be a period where you gradually transfer responsibility rather than all at once. There it was again, the request for me to resume the work while they maintained ownership. They wanted me to solve their problems while they kept control of the assets that were supposed to be my inheritance. It was manipulation wrapped in crisis management, desperation disguised as reasonable compromise. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Derek cleared his throat, falling back into his professional presentation mode. We're thinking of a management agreement where you resume operational control of the properties while maintaining the current ownership structure. You'd handle all tenant relationships, contractor coordination, and day-to-day management decisions. And in exchange, we'd reduce your monthly payment to $15,000, which is still above what you were earning before, and you'd have complete management autonomy without the legal responsibilities of ownership. The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity. They wanted to pay me less than they'd originally promised to do more work than I'd been doing before, all while maintaining legal control of assets they'd proven incapable of managing. It was the same exploitative dynamic they'd always intended, just with the pretense dropped. I set down the financial documents and looked at my daughter with the kind of clarity that comes from finally seeing someone exactly as they are. Victoria, do you remember what you told me about why this transfer was necessary? About how I was too old and stressed to handle property management effectively? She shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet my eyes. That was different. We were worried about you taking on too much responsibility as you got older, but now you want me to take on even more responsibility than I had before, for less compensation than you originally promised, while you maintain ownership of assets you can't manage. It's temporary, Derek interjected, just until we can stabilize the situation and develop our own operational systems. I laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise all three of us. Derek, you've had 6 weeks to develop operational systems. In that time, you've managed to lose more money than Thomas and I lost in our worst year ever. What makes you think more time will solve the fundamental problem? The fundamental problem, of course, was that Victoria and Derek had never wanted to be property managers. They'd wanted to be property owners, collecting rent checks and watching real estate appreciate while someone else handled the actual work. They'd assumed that ownership and management were separable, that they could enjoy the benefits without accepting the responsibilities. We made some mistakes, Victoria admitted. We underestimated the complexity and the time commitment, but we're learning, and with your guidance. No. The word came out more firmly than I'd intended, cutting through her plea with finality that surprised even me. I won't be providing guidance, management services, or any other form of assistance. You wanted these properties, and now they're yours to manage or sell as you see fit. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria stared at me as if I'd transformed into someone she didn't recognize, which in many ways was exactly what had happened. The accommodating mother who'd spent decades prioritizing her children's needs over her own had been replaced by someone who understood the difference between love and exploitation. Derek tried a different approach, appealing to what he probably assumed were my grandmotherly instincts. "Margaret, this is affecting more than just our finances. The stress is impacting our marriage, our health, our ability to plan for the future. Victoria barely sleeps anymore, and I'm working 18-hour days trying to coordinate contractors and manage tenant issues." "That does sound stressful," I agreed. "Property management is a demanding business that requires specific skills and experience. Perhaps you should consider selling the properties to someone better equipped to handle them." "Sell them?" Victoria's voice cracked with disbelief. "But they're our family legacy. They're supposed to be our children's inheritance." The irony was rich. Victoria had shown no interest in preserving family legacy when she was maneuvering to gain control of the properties. She'd been perfectly willing to manipulate me out of assets I'd spent 30 years building, but now that ownership was proving burdensome, she suddenly cared about preserving them for future generations. "Legacies are only valuable if they can be properly maintained," I said. "If you can't manage the properties profitably, they're not assets, they're liabilities. Selling them might be the most responsible choice you could make." Derek pulled out another set of documents, these ones showing what the properties might be worth in a current market sale. The numbers were substantial, enough to pay off their debts and leave them with significant profit, but also enough to reveal what they'd really lost through their mismanagement. "We've gotten some preliminary valuations," he said. "The portfolio could sell for approximately $4.2 million in the current market." $4.2 million. After paying off the loans they'd taken and covering the costs of the emergency repairs, Victoria and Derek would walk away with roughly $3 million. It was more money than most people see in a lifetime, but it was also significantly less than the properties would have been worth with proper management and continued appreciation. More importantly, it was a one-time windfall rather than the ongoing income stream they'd originally coveted. Instead of building wealth over time, they'd managed to convert income-producing assets into a lump sum that would be subject to capital gains taxes and provide no future earnings. $3 million is a substantial sum, I observed. Properly invested, it could provide a very comfortable supplement to your regular incomes. "But it's not what we planned," Victoria said, and for the first time I heard genuine grief in her voice. "We thought we'd be building on what you and Dad created, expanding the portfolio, creating something even bigger for our children." The grief was real, but it was grief for a fantasy that had never been realistic. Victoria and Derek had wanted the results of 30 years of careful property management without the years of learning, relationship building, and capital accumulation that had made those results possible. They'd thought they could skip the difficult parts and enjoy only the benefits. "Plans change," I said gently. "Sometimes we discover that what we thought we wanted isn't actually what we're suited for. There's no shame in recognizing that property. Management isn't your calling." Derek was making calculations on his tablet, probably figuring out exactly how much of their personal debt the sale would cover and how much they'd have left over. The numbers seemed to be providing some comfort, offering a path out of the crisis that would leave them financially whole if not wealthy, in the way they'd originally imagined. "If we did decide to sell," he said carefully, "would you be willing to help with the transition? Your knowledge of the properties and the local markets would be invaluable in maximizing the sale prices." Another request for my assistance, but this one felt different. Instead of asking me to solve their problems while they maintained control, they were asking for help in acknowledging their limitations and making a clean exit. It was the first honest conversation we'd had since the transfer began. "I could provide information about the property's histories and characteristics," I said, "but any decisions about pricing, timing, or sales strategy would need to be yours alone." I won't be taking responsibility for outcomes." Victoria looked up from the financial documents with an expression that mixed relief with something that might have been respect. "You really aren't going to rescue us, are you?" "No," I said simply. "I'm not. Even though we're your family? Even though this affects your grandchildren's inheritance?" "Especially because you're my family," I replied. "Rescuing you from the consequences of your choices wouldn't help you learn anything. It would just enable you to make the same mistakes again." The conversation continued for another hour, but the essential decisions had already been made. Victoria and Derek would put the properties on the market, use the proceeds to clean up their financial situation, and hopefully learn something about the difference between wanting something and being capable of managing it. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt in their defeat. I'd expected to feel vindicated, to enjoy watching them struggle with responsibilities they'd assumed would be easy. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness, not for their financial losses, but for the relationship damage that would probably never be fully repaired. Victoria had revealed herself to be someone capable of calculated manipulation, willing to exploit my love for her to gain control of my assets. That knowledge couldn't be unknown, couldn't be taken back or forgiven away. Our relationship would continue, but it would never again be based on the unconditional trust I'd once offered. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, watching the afternoon light fade over the hills and reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months ago, I'd been a widow trying to manage property ownership and family relationships with the same careful attention I'd always applied to both. Now, I was someone who'd learned to recognize manipulation and respond to it with strategic clarity rather than emotional compliance. The phone calls became less frequent after that. Victoria and Derek found a commercial real estate agent who specialized in income property sales, someone with the market knowledge and professional relationships they'd never developed. The sales process moved quickly, helped by strong demand for well-located rental properties in the Bay Area. I provided the historical information they needed about each property, sharing maintenance records and tenant histories without editorial comment. The buyers were experienced investors who understood both the opportunities and challenges of property management, people who wouldn't be surprised by termite treatments or roof replacements or difficult tenants. The final closing took place 8 weeks later in the same conference room where we'd celebrated the original transfer. The atmosphere was subdued rather than celebratory, marked by relief rather than triumph. Victoria and Derek had succeeded in extricating themselves from a situation that was destroying their financial stability and personal well-being, but they'd also abandoned their dreams of building generational wealth through real estate investment. After all debts were paid and taxes accounted for, they walked away with $2.7 million, a sum that would have seemed impossibly large to most people, but felt small compared to their original expectations. They'd learned an expensive lesson about the difference between owning assets and managing them successfully. But the most significant change was in our family dynamics. Victoria's attempts to manipulate me had failed so completely that she seemed uncertain how to relate to me going forward. The mother she'd thought she could control had been replaced by someone who made decisions based on her own interests rather than her children's demands. Our conversations became more honest, but also more distant. Victoria couldn't pretend her concern for my welfare had been genuine, and I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen her willingness to exploit my trust. We loved each other, but we were no longer operating under any illusions about each other's motivations or character. Michael called me from Portland after hearing about the property sales. His response was exactly what I'd expected from my most analytically minded child. "So Victoria and Derek discovered that property management is actually work," he said, amusement clear in his voice. "How long did it take them to figure that out?" "About 6 weeks of losing $8,000 a month." "Ouch, that's an expensive education. Are they at least financially okay after the sales?" "They're fine. They made some money, paid off their debts, and learned that they're not cut out for real estate investment. It could have been much worse. And how are you doing with all this? I know Victoria was trying to convince you to give up your independence. That was Michael, always cutting straight to the emotional heart of situations that others tried to navigate around. He'd understood from the beginning that Victoria's campaign wasn't really about my safety or competence, but about her desire to control my assets while avoiding responsibility for my welfare. "I'm doing well," I said, and realized I meant it. Completely. I'm living exactly the life I want to live, making my own decisions, and taking care of myself just fine. Good. You seemed different the last time we talked, stronger somehow. I wasn't sure what had changed, but I liked it. What had changed was my understanding of the difference between being a loving parent and being a convenient resource. For decades, I'd conflated the two, assuming that love meant making myself available to solve my children's problems regardless of how they treated me. I'd equated maternal success with self-sacrifice, measuring my worth by how much I could give rather than how much respect I commanded. But Victoria's manipulation had forced me to recognize that unconditional giving doesn't create unconditional love. It creates dependency and entitlement, patterns that ultimately damage both the giver and the receiver. Real love requires boundaries, expectations, and consequences. It requires teaching people how to treat you rather than accepting whatever treatment they choose to provide. The revelation was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. I started making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what others needed from me. I bought new furniture for the living room, not because the old furniture was worn out, but because I preferred a different style. I planned a trip to Scotland, a journey I'd been postponing for years, because there always seemed to be family obligations. That took priority. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for other people's approval before living my life. Victoria's opinion of my choices no longer carried special weight simply because she was my daughter. Her attempts to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my own interests fell flat because I no longer accepted guilt as a valid basis for decision-making. The transformation wasn't just psychological, it was practical. I hired a financial advisor who understood my goals rather than trying to manage complex investments myself. I joined a hiking group that explored trails throughout Northern California, something I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for. I started dating again, meeting a retired professor named James, who shared my love of gardening and had no interest in my financial situation. 6 months after the property sales were finalized, Victoria called to tell me she and Derek were expecting their first child. Her voice carried excitement mixed with uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure how I would react to the news. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. "When are you due?" "June. We're thrilled, but also terrified. Everything feels so expensive now, and we're trying to figure out how to budget for a baby when we're still getting used to managing our finances differently." There was something in her tone that suggested she might be hoping for financial assistance, but she didn't ask directly. Perhaps she'd learned something about the difference between asking for help and expecting automatic support. Perhaps the experience of losing control of my assets had taught her to be more careful about assuming my resources were available for her use. "Babies don't actually need as much as the magazines suggest," I told her. "Love, attention, and basic necessities are sufficient. The rest is marketing." We talked for another 20 minutes about pregnancy symptoms and nursery planning, the kind of normal mother-daughter conversation we'd rarely manage during the months of property manipulation. It wasn't the relationship we'd once had, but it was honest in a way our previous interactions had never been. After hanging up, I realized that Victoria's pregnancy offered me a choice about what kind of grandmother I wanted to be. I could return to my old patterns of unlimited giving and boundary-free support, or I could maintain the standards I'd learned to enforce in other areas of my life. I chose standards. When Victoria and Derek's financial situation becomes genuinely challenging, I'll consider ways to help that don't involve sacrificing my own security or enabling their dependency. I'll be a loving grandmother who provides appropriate support, without recreating the manipulative dynamics that had characterized our previous relationship. The woman who would have automatically written checks and volunteered unlimited assistance no longer exists. She's been replaced by someone who understands that love without boundaries isn't actually love. It's exploitation disguised as family, obligation. Sometimes I think about the properties that Victoria and Derek sold, wondering how the new owners are managing them and whether they're maintaining the standards Thomas and I established. But mostly, I don't look back. The portfolio was part of one phase of my life, and that phase is over. The current phase involves different priorities and different sources of satisfaction. I'm building relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial utility. I'm making choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. I'm living as someone who has value beyond what she can provide to others. At 67, I finally learned what it means to put myself first without apology. It's a lesson that came at the cost of some illusions about family loyalty and unconditional love, but it's been worth every difficult moment of the learning process. Victoria wanted my real estate portfolio, and I gave it to her exactly as she'd asked. What she discovered was that getting what you want isn't always the same as getting what you need, and that some lessons can only be learned through direct experience. As for me, I discovered that the most valuable thing I owned wasn't my property portfolio at all. It was my ability to recognize my own worth and demand appropriate treatment from the people who claim to love me. That's an asset no one can manipulate away, and it's the foundation for every good thing that's happened to me since. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Out!